great pleasure to invite Victoria Brittain, who is, as you will know, many of you, a journalist and writer, and who in the 1980s was writing about Southern Africa. But since 9/11, her focus has been on Guantanamo Bay and on civil liberties. I'm delighted to invite Victoria to speak.
Thank you very much, Diana, and thank you for inviting me to the organisers, and thank you all very much for coming. I'm going to talk about America, different bits of America and different visions of America. And starting, as Diana did, with former President Mandela, looking at how the media has played this over the last couple of days, it's taken me back to that era 25 years ago when I was a lot of my time in Angola and a lot of my time with exiled ANC people. When you listen to the BBC and look at a lot of the other media, the focus is on his statesmanship and his peacemaking. It's not on 25 years ago when he was in prison and there was a war. There was a war that he was totally behind. The South African Communist Party, of which he was a member, and the ANC were fighting for their survival as well as for the majority rule we see in South Africa today. That was the Cold War era of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, which the younger of you may not remember so clearly as those of us who were scarred by it do. At that time, the West was funding a war whose object was to destroy the economy and the infrastructure of newly independent Angola. And with it, the nationalist government of the MPLA. And this was mainly because the MPLA was giving a refuge and training facilities to the guerrilla forces of the SACP and the ANC, and to the Namibian Liberation Movement, SWAPO. In those days, when you didn't have Facebook and you didn't have everything that we have today, it was easier to run a clandestine war, which is what the Americans and the apartheid regime were doing. It was an American proxy war, and it was hidden behind the figure of Jonas Savimbi and his UNITA troops. UNITA was created, funded, trained, and supported in every way, including very significantly in propaganda, by the United States, and specifically by the CIA. And among its troops were black South Africans in UNITA uniforms. And the point of the whole exercise was keeping apartheid South Africa in business. That was the West's central issue. So the United States, although invisible, was not a bystander in those days in Southern Africa. The political project couldn't have been clearer, and I want to just quote something written theoretically by Savimbi, but I think I can imagine the offices that wrote it. And the words are so clear and so crude. Angola is the Munich of Africa. UNITA is the key to Angola. Angola is the key to Africa, and Africa is key to the West. He wrote this in 1986. He went on to write, Zaire, Zambia, Botswana, and Namibia would cease to be of the West, but would follow Angola in, quote, falling under Soviet domination. Of course, it was nonsense. There wasn't any Soviet domination, and nothing of that sort was going on. But it was a very effective propaganda line for a credulous media. And I know in the course of the day there'll be a lot of talk about credulous or ideological media. But the real key to Southern Africa in those years was a completely different one. It was Cuba and the Cuban Communist Party. In 1975, at the moment of Angolan independence, the South Africans invaded Angola, and the Americans sent proxy troops in from what is now Congo, but was then Zaire, as a pincer movement to try to prevent the MPLA from taking power. And it's an extraordinary it's difficult to imagine now the bravery and the ambition of the Cubans in deciding to send troops all that way across the ocean into a war that was completely incalculable. Nobody knew what the Americans were going to throw into it, or what the South Africans were going to throw into it, or what was the capacity of the different forces in Angola itself. It was a decision, as I said, that was incredibly brave, but it was a decision that I think encapsulates a lot of what we're talking about today. Because it was a decision in which more than 2,000 young Cubans lost their lives. Those Cubans were volunteers. It was a solidarity project for which they gave their lives, in just the way that Nelson Mandela, in his famous speech, said that for the majority rule in South Africa, he was prepared, if necessary, he said at Rivonia, to give his life. What happened next was 10 years of American-led and paid-for destabilization. It was a massive cost to the US taxpayers, although most of them didn't know it. What it did was ruin the hopes of Angola's independence, and it affected the political trajectory of the MPLA. But those Cuban volunteer doctors, teachers, engineers, and military who I used to admire more than I could possibly say in the conditions in which they worked in those years, they held off a social and military disaster. It was an individual and a collective sacrifice. It was a scene marked by destabilizations, by assassinations within the ANC and the SACP. It was a scene of immense sacrifice. In 1986, at the non-aligned meeting in Harare, I remember the speech given by Fidel Castro in which he used these words: "We will stay in Angola until the end of apartheid." The conference completely erupted. In that period, as I've said, there was this destabilization, there was this crushing of the whole region. It wasn't only happening in Angola. But those words gave everybody such courage. And at the time when he said that, the Cubans knew that the South Africans were planning a very major offensive from the south, in which they thought they would crush the MPLA and get the Cubans humiliatingly defeated to withdraw from Angola. In November of the following year, Fidel and the Central Committee made again another extraordinarily bold and ambitious decision, which was to reinforce the 25,000 troops they already had in Angola by sending another 9,000. And included in those 9,000 and the supplies that went with them were the best pilots, the best new aircraft that they had from the Soviet Union, the best new tanks and other equipment. And the Cuban plan, audacious as ever and incredibly brave, was a military confrontation which would force the South African Defence Forces to retreat from Angola, would force the logjam of occupied Namibia, force independence of Namibia, the South Africans to agree to that, and eventually to be the push by breaking the military, which would bring majority rule to South Africa. It was everything that Fidel had said in Harare in those few words. I'm not going to talk now about the Battle of Quito Carnivale, which lasted between March and July of 1988, and was led by General Hernando Sanchez, Ochoa Sanchez. But the weight of the military responsibility on the Cuban military leadership in Rwanda, as well as, of course, on the Angolan leadership, was something to behold. It was a life or death struggle. Everybody felt it. Of course, there was the media chorus and the Western diplomats who were predicting the imminent fall of Quito and the result that everybody wanted, the defeat of the Cubans and ignominious retreat. At the same time, some of you may remember Chester Crocker and his infamous constructive engagement with the apartheid regime, which he claimed was reforming itself and was something that everybody wanted to continue to do business with. All of this was followed by the media, and when I started thinking about this period, I thought of cases today of what we read about Venezuela and Ecuador in the media. You all know so well, and we'll be talking about that, as I said. And I just wanted to say that the threat of a different political path is exactly the same to the United States today as it was in the Cold War. That's how they see it. Alongside, in parallel with the fighting, negotiations went on in London and in Cairo, which were between the Russians, the Americans, the Cubans, and the Angolans. There were really only two players, the Cubans and the Americans. And as the Cubans and the Angolans turned the military tide, the tide of the negotiations changed. And by mid-1988, the South Africans knew that the air superiority in the south had beaten them. They were going to have to leave. And the rest is history. But I want just to remind everybody how, when we're thinking about Mandela now and we're listening to everything that is being said, remember that Quito, the Cubans, and the Angolan military was central to what happened. Of course, there were other countries destroyed by imperialism using proxy armies in the Cold War in the same period. Mozambique was one, El Salvador and Nicaragua were others. But there's another strand to all of this that has a particular relevance to Cuba and to all of us today. The United States and their Saudi friends financed a jihad against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. It was designed, as Brzezinski said at the time, to break the communists, to end the Cold War. This is his plan, was certainly a factor. But that anti-Soviet jihad was a magnet for thousands of Muslim men from dozens of countries. It fractured and it became an anti-Saudi jihad, and later it became an anti-American jihad. And the fallout now is Guantanamo Bay. In Guantanamo Bay today, there are 162 men. They're incarcerated without trial. An irony of ironies, they're incarcerated in occupied Cuba. This part of Cuba has been occupied so long that people have forgotten to be seriously indignant about it. It's a little bit like the occupied Palestinian territories. If occupations go on long enough, they become normalized in a way. But we can't afford to allow it to be normalized, and we can't afford not to be outraged by what the United States is doing in this part of Cuba today. 12 years have passed since the government of President George Bush made the dramatic decision to ignore half a century of international law, abrogate the Geneva Conventions, and bring us to a place today where these men I've mentioned, who have never been tried, and 84 of whom have actually been cleared by the Americans' own intelligence services, but have not been released, that they're still in American prison with no due process. And I want to just remind you of a few statistics that some of you might have forgotten. These are academic statistics, and they come from the research done by Seton Hall Law School in America. 66% of the people in Guantanamo Bay were not captured in Afghanistan, much less on any battlefield. Most of them were handed over to the Americans by Pakistanis in exchange for bounties paid by the Americans. Another 20% of those men were handed over by the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan for the same reason, for bounties. 55% of the people who've been in Guantanamo Bay had never, according to these academics, committed any hostile act against the United States. The Defense Department's own statistics indicate that only 8% of the men could be described as Al-Qaeda fighters. This is 12 years of history we're talking about here. This very week, 2 men were forcibly repatriated from Guantanamo Bay to Algeria, the one place in the world that they didn't want to go. One of them, Jamil Amezian, had actually got an invitation to live in Canada. In 2006, he'd had one to live in Luxembourg. He'd never been released. So today, he's in a prison in Algeria. It's completely impossible to convey the horror of Guantanamo Bay in words. I'm going to try. 15 men are being force-fed in restraint chairs twice a day, in contradiction of all medical ethics. The current hunger strike has lasted since February, and at one point, 2/3 of the men in Guantanamo Bay were on hunger strike. Over this period, men turned into skin and bones, according to their lawyers who saw them. One of them has an ongoing court case to get an independent doctor into Guantanamo to see his client. And violence is a daily norm, with invasive body searches of a humiliating nature, manhandling of prisoners in and out of cells by special teams of heavy soldiers in body armour. Solitary confinement for many has lasted for months or even for years. There's a litany of physical and psychological deterioration. All this is documented, and the people responsible of it now amount to many thousands of Americans who have done this dirty work. Guantanamo is the symbol of a new normality imposed on our world since that reckless Bush-era phrase, the war on terror. I'm not going to go into what all the aspects of that are, but you know many of them. But Guantanamo Bay is, for me, the central symbol of this. But I have to just mention the drones. The drones, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, who have the same destroyed cities as I used to see in Njiva and Kwambo and other places in Angola, and the same as we did to people in Fallujah. Now, besides Mr. Amezian, I'm going to mention another individual in Guantanamo Bay whose name you will know, Shaka Ama, who is a Saudi national and a British resident with a British family. You may have heard Shaka recently speak on a CBS program. His words were unbearable. And I just want to end by telling you that on Tuesday, there will be a meeting in the House of Commons hosted by the great MP John McDonnell on Shaka's case. And we're talking here about solidarity on many fronts. I hope that many of you might come to that meeting, because it's not just about Shatta, it's about Guantanamo Bay, it's about American indifference to justice, and it's about the kind of solidarity that we want to learn from others and to give to others. Thank you very much for this.